All right. Hi guys. Um, all right. Let's let's get this lecture started. On Thursday we finished talking about Kohlberg's theory, and we finished off with some of the criticisms, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some differences in morality between men and women. Um, so, in terms of differences in gender and morality, um, studies show that females generally tend to show more kind of sense of guilt and shame, and also more empathy towards others. They're also more likely to take personal responsibility for things. Even like in a simple example, like if you step on their foot or something, they're more likely to apologize, and reason that maybe they were in your way. And this is most likely not due to some sort of inherent, gender difference, biological difference between the genders, but because females are socialized this way to be more kind of oriented towards taking care of others, and to think more about kind of their role in the relationships. And also, they tend to internalize more, which is something that we talked about in the emotional development chapter. Um, so females, tend to engage in more prosocial behaviors. So in that respect, kind of their moral reasoning may look different from the outside than does males. We do know that males do tend to be helpful as well, right? They're not kind of not pro-social per se, but they generally tend to be more helpful when they're in public as opposed to when they're by themselves. And also, if it's kind of a female who needs help, they're more likely to swoop in, sort of this, damsel in distress scenario. Again, something that is most likely they're being socialized to do, not an inherent difference between genders. But Carol Gilligan proposed this different theory of kind of the difference between morality between males and females. And she talked about these different orientations. So she said that men tend to have this justice orientation, um, which essentially is kind of this emphasis on fairness and equal rights, and kind of this more global overall perspective. And women tend to take more of this care orientation. So they focus more on the interpersonal relationships and kind of taking care of others, meeting other needs. And in general, kind of compassion for individuals is a more prominent factor in moral behavior for females than it is for males. Males tend to take a little bit more of kind of an objective, take a step back and look at the bigger picture type of moral reasoning. And women, at least according to some researchers, tend to kind of use their sense of empathy and compassion more when reasoning. Um, about a moral dilemma or something. So they see, women tend to see morality in terms of responsibility towards individuals and kind of their willingness to sacrifice themselves. To them, that's acting in a moral way, which is not something that men tend to do as much. According to Carol Gilligan, women go through their own stages of moral development, and morality kind of progresses from focusing on own needs, right? Similar to Kohlberg's first level, where the focus on the self. But for women, the second level of morality involves sacrificing themselves fully for others and really just focusing on giving to others, and that's morality for them. That's how to behave in a moral fashion. And only at the highest level of moral development do women start understanding that there needs to be a healthy balance, right? They can't constantly give, give, give. That's not always kind of the highest morality either. You have to take care of yourself in order to be able to continue giving. And so finding this healthy balance between own needs and those of others is, according to Carol Gilligan, the highest level of reasoning, moral reasoning for women. Her theory has met its own fair share of criticism, and researchers still haven't quite agreed on um, kind of the progression of moral development and whether or not there really are differences between genders. So some researchers argue that Both genders do use both justice and care orientation at different times, just kind of depending on situation. It doesn't really depend on a gender, but more depends on the situation. So, kind of this question of how morality develops and whether or not it's different between genders is still not settled out there. So, there's still kind of debates going on. So another aspect of kind of differences in moral development, as we've said in class, is some of the influences of culture and ethnicity. So obviously, throughout the world, as human beings, most of us kind of have a similar ideas of what's right and wrong, right? We all kind of value individual rights and things like human life and kind of concern for others and helping others, being a good Samaritan, right? Those are themes that are prominent throughout all of our kind of religious stories or legends, or even children's books that teach children how to behave, kind of what's right and what's wrong. Um, we do know that there are some subtle differences in the way that different cultures view morality. So, Eastern cultures tend to emphasize a sense of duty towards others more. They tend to be more collectivistic and kind of more oriented towards being helpful towards others. That's a greater value, generally speaking, in Eastern cultures. While Western cultures are more individualistic, and so they tend to kind of value more um, parts of morality that have to do with kind of individual rights and liberty and justice. Um, so those may be some of kind of the differences in moral reasoning that you might observe if you were to ask the same moral dilemma from folks of different cultures. There's also, throughout the world, as we know, right, there are different standards for right and wrong to some extent. So some cultures, for example, take, much kind of stronger stance on equality between genders, for example, women's rights, right? That's something that here in America, for example, we like to think that we're pretty progressive, even though, of course, there's still room for improvement, very much so. But in other countries, a woman is still considered a second-class citizen, doesn't have much rights. It's legal to, for a husband to kill his wife or to beat her up in some countries. So in that respect, again, there are some differences in kind of how people think about morality, how they would respond to some of these ethical kind of moral dilemmas. Also, things like lying, for example, in Eastern cultures, it is much more acceptable to lie if you're lying to kind of to save face and to preserve your dignity and honor. Whereas in Western cultures, we're more kind of, we just think that lying is um, not right no matter what, right? We value a person who kind of says it as it is, right? And then, of course, religion plays a role in some of the differences between cultures. So, different religions kind of emphasize different behaviors or prohibit different things. Like, some religions may really be strict about prohibiting homosexual relationships, for example, right? And people who follow those religious views may view it as moral to discriminate against, homosexuals, for example, as opposed to people without a religion, but with a highly developed moral compass, or folks in kind of maybe some sort of other religious um, school of thought may believe that all people deserve respect and equality no matter what sexual orientation they ascribe to. And so again, you will see, depending on people's religion, different moral behaviors and different reasoning. And we'll talk about religion here in a little bit. But let's talk a little bit more about kind of the developmental trends of morality, just kind of in general terms. So we know that the internal standards for morality do develop early. So kids really know kind of what's right and wrong even before age 2. So um, there is kind of some natural, a quick understanding of kind of what's right and wrong, and kids will understand that hitting somebody is wrong, even if they don't always get consequences for it, right? You still can tell that they know that it's wrong, even if they're doing it. Um, or they will, say like, oh, like if something breaks, for example, right? If they broke a vase, they know that that's not right. So they do have these internal standards pretty early on. And as they develop, their emotional development helps develop their moral reasoning as well, right? So as these more complicated emotions start to emerge, as we've talked a little bit about that in the emotional development section, um, things like guilt, for example, starts emerging, um, which, obviously a sense of guilt is essential for you to be able to have a conscience, right? We know that a sociopath and a psychopath don't have a sense of guilt. And of course, their moral compass is very much skewed. Um, Things like, feelings of shame, feelings of empathy and sympathy. All of these help children behave in a more moral fashion, um, right? Obviously, if you feel shame about acting badly, or not listening to your parents, or not like being mean to a peer on the playground, then you're less likely to repeat that behavior, right? And this is how kind of morality starts progressing, because at first you try to behave morally because you want to avoid kind of feeling bad about yourself, right? Which is the first level of Kohlberg's moral development. Um, so children, at first kind of utilize a cost benefit analysis when they decide whether or not to act morally, right? So they're much more likely to behave morally if the cost of acting morally is low, and the benefit is high, right? Like helping out a friend on a playground doesn't really cost too much, but the benefit of feeling good about yourself, or maybe even the teacher noticed that you were helping a friend, and now you look good in front of the teacher, or maybe your friend is going to feel grateful towards you and maybe share their toy later with you, right? Sometimes benefits outweigh the costs of acting good, and then people don't have a problem. Usually, children don't have a problem with acting in a moral fashion, um, as opposed to, if the cost of acting morally is very high, um, like maybe standing up for your friend in front of a bully, right, and being afraid that the bully is going to beat you up as well, then kind of less kids are going to jump in and act kind of in this moral, kind of do the right thing. So um, this kind of ability to do the right thing even when the cost to you is high is a much higher developmental level of morality, and so children don't often show that. And then they're kind of the understanding of fairness evolves. So they don't always kind of understand that equality doesn't mean justice, right? They first kind of focus on fairness towards themselves, so they will only notice if things weren't fair towards them. But if they got their fair share, they may not notice that others may have not gotten their fair share. So, again, kind of this egocentric focus on the self. And then they will, understand that equality means equality for everybody, and they will notice if somebody else didn't get their equal share. But they think that as long as everybody got an equal, piece of the pie or something, then that's fair, right? That's all there is to it. And only later on, at a higher level, can children understand that sometimes circumstances, right? Equality doesn't always mean fairness. Sometimes people either have special needs and need some sort of additional accommodations, or maybe they have merit, right? They deserve maybe more than somebody who, maybe this kid worked really hard on the project and this kid barely, worked at all. The kid who worked really hard, of course, deserves more, right, than the kid who barely put in any kind of work. Um, so this is kind of what I mean, when I talk about equality, it doesn't mean justice, right? Equality is right when everybody gets kind of their fair share, but everybody's different, right? So that's not always fair. Justice is when everybody gets kind of what they need, um, what they require to achieve the same level, kind of the same standards of living, or the same kind of level of happiness or satisfaction as everybody else. Um, let's see. So, some of the factors that affect moral development. We know that maternal support and responsiveness is really important in development of empathy and prosocial behavior, and that makes sense. If you remember our lecture on attachment, right? If you feel kind of secure and loved in this world, it is easier to be concerned about others and to really genuinely want to help others and to be able to understand others' perspective. And if you yourself don't feel secure in this world, then it's hard to worry about somebody else. So when you feel loved, it's easier to love others. So maternal support is really really important to kind of foster the sense of security in children, so that from that secure base they can explore kind of different aspects of morality of this world and kind of learn to understand other people's perspective. Um, General cognitive development is, of course, really important as well. So, for example, morality is a very kind of abstract concept in a lot of ways, right? This idea of kind of justice and human rights and kind of the difference between, equality and justice are pretty abstract concepts that would be difficult for little children to grasp. So, the more cognitively developed children are, the more they're able to grasp these higher level kind of moral thinking, right? Remember Kohlberg's third level of moral reasoning involves, these abstract kind of universal ideas of human rights, which for little kids are practically impossible to grasp. Um, a sense of self also affects moral development, so we tend to integrate kind of our moral values into our identity, right? So some people may really take pride in that part of their identity, like I'm somebody, like I'm a feminist, for example, or I'm somebody who really is an advocate for social justice, and people like that who integrate it into their identity are more likely to act in kind of a consistently higher moral fashion than if morality is really not part of your identity. Then maybe that's something that you were never taught, or it was not never emphasized by your parents, or maybe you grew up in an abusive family, right? And you don't even know much about what morality is all about. Um, then these kids will likely end up with kind of showing lower levels of moral reasoning. Um, Also, interaction with peers and siblings is really important. So, children who have played with other children, they learn kind of these really important values of sharing and how to be cooperative, how to resolve conflicts in a way that will kind of achieve a mutually satisfactory result. Um, so it's really important to have your children play with other kids. Um, we know that folks who grow up with siblings, for example, oftentimes show kind of better skills of negotiating and resolving conflict because they have to do it on a daily basis. So it's a really essential aspect of development for children. You have to let them kind of learn to figure their own conflicts out. If a parent is always kind of on guard, ready to swoop in and resolve conflicts for children, then they're never going to learn how to reason through it and how to understand, kind of take other person's perspective, how to use their empathy in order to guide their moral behavior. Um, another important factor in development of morality is the types of kind of reasoning and rationale that adults provide, right? So if adults really kind of take the time to explain to children what is right and what is wrong and why maybe this something that they did was not right, um, then children will obviously learn that over time and learn kind of reach a higher level of moral reasoning, right? If an adult models kind of this moral reasoning and talks through it with the child, and the child will incorporate it into their own self-talk. Remember, like Vygotsky was talking about um, how children learn to think through their interactions with adults. Also, it's important, to set high standards for children, to really expect them to act in a moral fashion. Um, and, then they will, if you have low expectations for your children, of course, they're not going to, um, you know, kind of try to reach higher level than the level of expectation that you have for them. Um, And then the types of personal consequences that adults provide for children are also important. So it's important to not only kind of punish the child for behaving maybe in a mean way or for acting kind of not morally, but it's also important to explain to them why they're being punished and kind of what was it that they did wrong. Because for those adults who tend to only focus on punishment, right, or like this is not right because I said so, right, and there's not much more explanation going on, then these children will end up being at a lower level of moral reasoning, right? If parents only focus on punishment, then that's what the child is only going to focus on. And remember, that's Kohlberg's first level of moral reasoning, right? Kind of behaving in a good way in order to avoid punishment, not because it's the right thing to do. And that's not something that we want our kids end up with. So it's important for adults to not just provide consequences and hope that the child is going to somehow magically understand themselves what is it that they did wrong, but it's important for adults to help children understand how to think through these things and how to reason in a more moral fashion. Um, Exposure to moral dilemmas above one's level also helps, right? So it's always important to challenge children. Remember, we talked about cognitive development, both from perspective of Piaget and Vygotsky. It's important to challenge, and that's how children are going to grow, right? If they never encounter moral dilemmas that are kind of more difficult for them to grasp, then they're not going to reach that higher level. So whenever children face some sort of a dilemma, it's important for adults to kind of sit down and to let children, think through it themselves. Like, well, what do you think? What should we do? Why is that the right thing? And kind of help challenge children to think through it. But then, of course, offer scaffolding and help them kind of reason through it in a more moral way. And then again, religion, right? So religion is a huge kind of influence, right, on people's behavior. And it does provide a rationale for acting humanely, even for those of us who maybe don't have the highest moral compass on our own, right? Even if you focus on just kind of the first level of Kohlberg's moral development, and only worry about kind of consequences for yourself, right? Religion ultimately tells us act good and you will make it into heaven, right? That's kind of the concept of most of religious schools of thought. So religion, some describe religion as kind of a social kind of system of keeping society under check, right? Of making sure that society acts in a more or less moral standard, even if their personal morality doesn't quite reach that level necessarily. Um, so let's talk a little bit about religion and spirituality. Religion is a really kind of passionate topic for a lot of people. And, if you look at the history of our world, I mean, there were wars that would start about religious beliefs, about differences in religious beliefs all over the place. I mean, that's a really, that used to be a really common, and I mean, still is really a common reason for starting a war. So it's a very, very strong, kind of passionate topic for a lot of people. And a lot of people act in such kind of determined ways based on their religious beliefs. Um, but religion is a very kind of powerful source of emotional support for a lot of people too. We do know research shows that religion really helps people kind of overcome a lot of their personal maybe struggles, emotional difficulties, especially at the times of grief or extreme stress. We know that religion also correlates with better physical health, even. So, religion is definitely an incredibly important aspect of human life. Um, and worldwide, more than 80% of people identify with a religious group. So, majority of people in this world believe in some sort of religious organization. Only 16% report no religious affiliation, which makes it the third largest group worldwide after Christians and Muslims. But surveys actually show that many of folks who consider themselves unaffiliated with any religion actually do have some religious or spiritual beliefs nonetheless, like belief in God or some sort of a spirit, but they just don't identify with a particular faith, or they don't engage in any kind of traditional kind of religious rituals. So actually, it's probably more than 80% of people who really are religious or spiritual in one way or another. So really, majority of people engage in some sort of um, kind of engage in some sort of relationship with a higher power. And there is a difference between spirituality and religion. So spirituality is kind of your sense of connection with some higher power, while religion is just kind of the set of traditions, rituals, or beliefs, or conventions of meaning that kind of define spirituality. So spirituality is something that we are born with, while religion is kind of defined by our culture. It's a set of rules that define our spiritual practice. So, following that logic, we can be spiritual but not religious, right? So, that's kind of our 16% of unaffiliated, right? A lot of them are still spiritual. But you cannot be religious without being spiritual. So, spirituality is kind of this individual attribute, it's this innately human trait. Most of us actually are born with this spirituality, this kind of tendency to kind of reach or seek for that higher power, for that hidden meaning, right, behind kind of the everyday physical aspects of the world. And our religion just kind of shapes our expression of our spirituality for most of us. And some of us don't need that shape, right? And we don't affiliate with any kind of religion, but may still be spiritual. So, in terms of religious development, researchers, when studying the development of religiousness in children, um, used kind of similar to Piaget. They gave children these Bible stories and pictures and asked them different questions about it. And from that, they kind of figured out different levels of thinking, of how children progress through their religious cognitive development. And so researchers also used Piaget's approach to cognitive development, kind of to organize the development of religion in children. So you will notice that the terms are similar to Piaget's terms of cognitive development. So first, from birth to about age 7, is called a pre-operational intuitive religious thought. So this is really an unsystematic religious thinking. At this point, children really cannot grasp the concept of religion, of God. I mean, it's a more abstract, or it's a very abstract concept, right? And so it's hard up until a certain age for children to even kind of begin grasping it. So really, at this age they show little to no understanding of religious stories. If you give them kind of the stories or give them pictures, they won't be able to kind of come up with systematic, logical, some sort of explanation or kind of line of thinking. Um, at age 7, so from about 7 up until adolescence, so in elementary and middle school, children show concrete operational religious thought. So they focus on concrete details of the story rather than abstract, right? So they may kind of hold a very literal view of God as, a bearded old guy who's sitting up on the cloud, right? And these biblical figures like angels flying through little clouds, right? And heavenly music playing. So they have a really kind of a literal view, because it's hard for them to grasp the abstract nature of God. Again, remember, according to Piaget, abstract thought does not develop until about age 12, right? And children at this age tend to accept their religious identity in kind of this unquestioning manner. So usually, most likely, they will follow their parents' religious affiliation, right? And especially if parents go to school or go to church, or children attend Sunday school, for example, um, or I'm talking about kind of Christian religion, but in other religions, right, there are other ways of kind of maintaining the traditions and engaging in religious services, that if children observe their parents do it from the young age, and they themselves are engaged in it even before they really grasp the concept of religiousness, then they will just come to accept it as part of their life, and they're not really going to question it up until about adolescence, right? And so around age 14, this is where formal operational religious thought develops. Um, and teenagers start to understand the abstract meaning of the stories. So they really start understanding that, these biblical figures may not have necessarily ever lived for real, right, in our world, but just can represent these important messages, important lessons of humanity. Um, and children, teenagers at this age may start questioning their religious identity, right? Remember, this is the time when they're trying to figure themselves out. And the important task, according to Erickson, right, for example, is to develop their identity. And so, religious identity is a really big part of identity for some people. Um, and so teenagers may either they may kind of drastically change their perspective. They may kind of distance themselves from the religion that they were raised in and kind of go off and try something else, try other religious affiliations, or maybe try being kind of not religious for a while. Or they may become really, really religious, right? Maybe as children they didn't really care about it much. They just, went to church to appease their parents. They didn't really think about it twice. But then as the teenagers, they really start believing in this and really kind of take to heart all of these religious messages from the Bible, for example. So, this is kind of the time for them to really figure themselves out in terms of their religion, as well as, in terms of all other aspects of their identity, really. And then as adults, we usually come into some sort of acceptance and understanding of ourselves as religious beings, and we understand our own kind of religious affiliation, right? Whatever it is that we decide on is through that process as teenagers. But oftentimes we know that adults, even those who are not really engaged in much of religious practices, don't really maybe think about religion often on daily basis, don't go to church or something. Even those adults oftentimes use religion to cope with life's events and misfortunes. Um, so if something happens, most people tend to turn to religion, right? Because it's such a source of power, right? And when you feel like you're out of control over some sort of horrible events going on in your life, it's natural, to turn to some sort of spiritual figure out there that you feel like maybe has control over this life. Maybe that's the only creature out there that may have control, right? And so people desperately turn to that aspect of the world, to some sort of spiritual figure as kind of last attempt to regain control over their lives. Um, and religion to a lot of people, those who kind of stay with it and really engage in religious services, maybe, or attend church on a weekly basis. Religion really offers a lot of social support and a sense of unity to people. So it's a really powerful force in human lives. Um, and then in late adulthood, people tend to come to stronger religious beliefs, right? As they kind of grapple with questions of death, right? I mean, that's religion. That's what a religion is about, really, right? Kind of in a lot of ways, thinking about the afterlife, right? What happens after we die? And so oftentimes, adults in kind of their late adulthood tend to come to stronger religious beliefs. And these are related to greater life satisfaction because they offer kind of this sense of support and unity and kind of maybe a little bit more sense of control over your life. Um, and even, some studies really link the prayer and attendance of religious services with better health. So again, as healthcare providers, this is something that may be interesting to talk about with your patients if you're in that kind of line of work, because religion can really, help people improve their physical well-being. There are studies, for example, about how folks who meditate through the process of meditation, they've kind of done the physical kind of evaluation of their body as people would meditate, and they would notice that their pain would go away and inflammation tends to decrease. So there's actual physical changes that happen in our body as we pray and meditate and in one way or another, whatever it is, but somehow connect with higher power out there. So it's a really can be a very strong kind of source of support, physical and emotional for people. Something to kind of not dismiss as a potential kind of source of help for folks. Um, and we'll talk a little bit more about kind of this whole idea of death and dying in our last chapter. We'll come back to some of these ideas there again. Um, okay, so now kind of switching gears, we're talking about morality and religiousness, and of course, as we talk about morality, we can't not talk about the other kind of side of the coin, right? Aggression, violence. Um, so in terms of aggression in children, obviously we know that infants don't act aggressively. So aggression is not something that we start out doing in our lives, right? Aggression is defined as an intentional harm to somebody, um, and obviously infants don't act with intention, so they can't intentionally harm somebody. Therefore, they don't show aggression. It is not until preschool that we start seeing kind of a true aggression in children. And usually, this aggression is really directed at attaining some sort of a goal, right? It's like getting a toy. Like maybe you push another kid out of the way because you want this toy, or you kind of rip it out of their arms, or kids may kind of push other kids out of the way if they want to get into this particular space, maybe see something or get into this toy car or something. So aggression is pretty frequent in preschoolers because they don't know kind of how else to attain their goals. They haven't developed other means of kind of effective communication and problem solving. But their aggression at this age usually is not particularly harmful. So children will kind of push each other, maybe slap each other, but they're not going to kind of beat each other up, or it's usually pretty kind of not intense form of aggression. So extreme and sustained aggression in little children of this age is a cause of concern. It's definitely something to check out. It is not normal. Um, so kind of mild aggression is normal, but more extreme cases definitely are a cause of concern. And through preschool years, children become better at controlling their emotions, and they have increasingly sophisticated language skills, and they become better at self regulation. And so these skills allow them to resolve conflict in other ways other than violence. So they can, ask for a toy instead of ripping it out of somebody's hands, right? Or they can tell somebody, you're hurting me, instead of kind of pushing them back. Um, and so aggression tends to kind of decrease through the preschool years towards the end. Um, and you know later on in school, kind of it's really normal to expect children to be able to resolve their conflicts using their words and to kind of control their strong emotions, even though of course even we as adults sometimes have a hard time controlling our aggression, right? So obviously nobody's perfect, but um, it's not normal kind of to see again these sustained serious kind of aggressive behavior from children. And in terms of kind of gender differences, we know that boys tend to show greater physical and instrumental aggression. So boys tend to kind of get into physical fights more often than girls. And instrumental aggression is just an aggression motivated by this desire to obtain a goal. So they will be aggressive only because they're trying to get to a goal of some sort. Again, get like a toy that they want, or um, you know. Get kind of a higher status in class, for example, right? That's why you're going to bully somebody who seems weak, for example. Um, Girls don't engage in physical violence as much, and usually they show greater amounts of relational aggression. And relational aggression is non physical, but it is directed usually at hurting another person's feelings or damaging their relationships. So maybe telling kind of lies about somebody, gossiping about somebody, right? So damaging them in a way that's kind of hard to respond to, right? It's kind of like this backstabbing, right? It sort of like goes behind the victim's back, and sometimes they may not even know that this particular girl is actually doing the harm. So the relational aggression is much harder to address than instrumental aggression, which is usually kind of happens just in the moment, and then you can choose to respond appropriately, and then that's that. Um, as we talk about aggression in children, of course, we can't not mention school violence. That is a topic that has been pretty kind of prominent in the media for a good reason, right? School violence does happen, unfortunately, and there are some very famous and sad examples of what happens during school shootings. Um, we know kind of a lot of things about characteristics of school shooters. So at this point, people are kind of better aware of how to predict um, um, or kind of spot a potential shooter. So characteristics of shooters do include low tolerance for frustration, right? So they can't control themselves very well. They have poor coping skills, poor self-regulation skills, right? If they kind of get angry, they don't know what else to do with it but to act out violently. They don't have any other ways of calming themselves down or to understand their emotions or to use their words, right? Or kind of work like use their problem solving skills to address the problem. They don't know how to do that, so they are more likely to just turn to violence to resolve their issues. They also tend to be more kind of alienated loners. They oftentimes are kids who are not very popular in class, who don't have a lot of friends. um, Oftentimes these are the kids who are being bullied in school. They tend to be very kind of self-centered, right? So they have a hard time showing empathy or kind of taking other people's perspective or even being concerned about other people's well-being. They're very much focused on themselves. um, and then they oftentimes have this sense of resentment over perceived injustice, right? So maybe, right, they're being bullied in school, which is a legitimate problem, right? But of course not everybody at school is to blame for their bullying, right? But they do start blaming kind of the entire school and everybody in the world. um, or maybe they were dumped by their girlfriend or boyfriend, right? Um, and or maybe they got a low grade in school, right? And then they're angry at the teacher, and that happens. And then they show up in school and they just decide to shoot up everybody. Um, they let's see. Typically, school shootings are planned. So, despite what you may think, it's not that a shooter just kind of got fed up and ran home and grabbed the gun and came back and shot everybody. Usually, it is something that they've been carrying out for a while. They've been planning it. They've been kind of picking a good day, picking their weapon, picking their kind of how they're gonna do it, what they're gonna do. Um, they usually actually tell somebody about their plans. In fact, we know that at almost half the cases, the shooters have told to their friends that they're going to go and shoot up in their school, and in half the cases, they're actually encouraged by their friends, right? So their friends would be like, "Oh, yeah, that's cool," or "No, you're not gonna do it. Prove us wrong." So in one way or another, friends would know about this, but they either didn't think much of it or thought that it was a good idea. Maybe they were similar kind of violent group of people. Um, Regardless, right? We know that there's always warning signs for shooting. So there's always this kid who either tells somebody about their plans, or they show these kind of characteristics. They show these violent kind of predisposition, um, this low ability to tolerate their frustration. um, there's some sort of built tension, and after the shooting, you actually oftentimes you hear people say, oh yeah, I just knew that kid was up to no good. Yeah, I always knew there was something wrong with this kid, right? And you just want to be like, well, if you knew that there's something wrong, why didn't you say something, right? Why didn't you address this problem? And that's, I mean, that's the case, right? Like we usually know that something is up, but we don't believe, like we don't trust our gut instinct, or we don't really know what to do about it. So that's why they're starting to do, right, all these like school shooter trainings and stuff, because it's important for people to be able to recognize the signs and to know what to do when something just doesn't feel right. um, we also know that in two-thirds of school shootings, attackers used guns from their own home or that of a relative, right? So that's another kind of important topic of discussion, not for this class, but kind of a food for thought in terms of when talking about kind of gun laws and stuff like that. This is often used as kind of one of the points of argument. Um, but school shootings in general, like I don't mean to, I don't want to make it sound like, oh my gosh, it's happening all over the place, right? Despite what media will have you believe, school shootings are actually really rare. um, Less than 1% of youth homicide occurs in schools, which makes them actually a really safe place for children. A child actually has 1 in a million chance of being killed in a school. So it's not kind of the biggest source of public threat out there, but it's definitely something to be aware of, to be thinking about, and to definitely, if you feel like something is off, if you have some sort of a gut feeling um, about this, maybe this kid that you're seeing in your practice, definitely talk to somebody, and kind of don't just let it go, because that's kind of, I think, the most important lesson is that um, there's always there's always warning signs. There's always somebody who saw something that maybe could have stopped the shooting, and they just didn't think twice about it. So, um, switching gears a little bit, we'll talk about Albert Bandura, because his research is really focused on how children learn aggression. Um, so, Albert Bandura is an American psychologist. He works at Stanford University. He's actually still alive, which most of the folks that we've talked about in this class, right, lived like in the beginning of the last century or something. But this guy's still around, and he coined this social cognitive theory. So his theory came after excuse me, after the behaviorist movement, right? Remember, we learned about classical and operant conditioning, and how, the environment kind of influences our behavior through rewards and punishments, right? If we behave in a certain way and then we get a reward for it, then we're more likely to behave in that way again. If we get punished after behavior, then we're less likely to engage in that behavior, right? Well, Bandura said that that's kind of a simplistic way of describing how behavior comes about, right? Behavior is not always a response to direct reward or punishment, right? Oftentimes, kids engage in a behavior that they've kind of never been rewarded or punished for before, right? So, how do you explain that? Um, so he said that it's a much more complex question. He said that behavior is learned from the environment through the process of observational learning, right, or modeling. So kids watch other people engage in behaviors, and they watch whether or not those people got rewards or punishments, um, right? And then kids can anticipate, okay, if I behave in the same way, that person got rewarded for that behavior. So maybe if I behave in that same way, I'm going to be rewarded as well. So, kids are much more likely to repeat the behavior that they've seen if they saw it being rewarded, right? If you see somebody like a bully in school, right, beating somebody up, and then they get in trouble and they get sent home, and school makes a big deal out of it, then maybe you're less likely to engage in a similar behavior than if you saw the bully kind of get away with it and other kids liking this bully, right, and cheering them on. then you might be more likely to engage in that similar behavior as well. So it's kind of similar to, kind of the concept of, monkey sees, monkey does, right? Um, and so models can really be anybody, right? So children observe all sorts of models in their environments. These can be, teachers, parents, of course, are a huge source of role modeling. Their peers, right? People in the media, which is why, right, it's so important what kind of cultural icons your child kind of follows, right, and likes. Um, so let's see. I have a little video about Bandura's research. He, made this really um, most famous research in modeling. It's called the Bobo doll experiment. And so children were kind of exposed to an adult who beats and kicks and yells at this Bobo doll. Um, and then the observation was that kids actually went ahead and were much more rough with this Bobo doll, um, and actually repeated a lot of aggressive acts towards the Bobo doll that they saw in an adult, um, as compared to the group of children who saw another adult playing gently with the Bobo doll or not touching the Bobo doll, right? So that was, kind of a really drastic finding that Bandura actually didn't expect. Um, let's see. Let me just show you the video, and then I'll talk about it some more. Uh, so here's the video. Okay, here it is.
Watson had shown that emotions are learnt, and Harlow that we are intensely social creatures. So it was natural to put these two ideas together and ask how much of what we do and feel is learnt from other people. In 1961, American psychologist Albert Bandura set out to see how far just watching other people influences our behavior. Bandura chose to study aggression. At the time, the widespread view was that watching violence reduces aggression. It purges us. But was this true? To find out, Bandura experimented on small children, aged 3 to 5. So what Bandura did is he put an adult in a room with a child and a bunch of toys, including something he called the Bobo doll, which is a giant inflatable doll. Then what happened after about a minute, the adult unexpectedly started beating up the doll in really quite a vicious manner, shouting, screaming, kicking, hitting with a hammer, and went on like this for about 10 minutes. What would the child do if after watching the adult they were left in a room on their own with the same toys? Ooh, she really is going for it. She's doing exactly the same as she saw the adult do. She's lifted the doll up and now she's really hammering it. She's got a little hammer out. She's having a go at its toes now. Shows innovation, if nothing else. Every child who watched the adult being violent copied much of what they'd seen. The closest imitation was when a child observed an adult of the same sex. Now he's got a gun out and he's using that, a combination of the gun and the hammer, to just whack the doll. He's got a very aggressive expression on his face. Importantly, another group who had watched an adult play gently played calmly, showing no signs of aggression. Basically, what the children saw, the children did. This was an utterly unexpected finding. Before Bandura did this experiment, psychologists thought that seeing somebody else acting out a violent scene would be cathartic, it would sort of purge you. But what this clearly demonstrated and really shocked people at the time is that actually what happens when you see something doing violent actions, you tend to imitate them. Bandura's findings were given added impact by his timing. His experiment took place just as television was moving into the home. 2 years later, Bandura reran his experiment with one important difference. This time, he wanted to compare how children react to watching an aggressive adult, not in real life, but on film. Children watched two versions. One was a straightforward recording of the adult beating up the Bobo doll. The second, a fantasy version, with the attacking adult dressed as a cat. In almost every case, Bandura got the same results. Children imitated what they'd seen. The results were dynamite. This was one of the first experiments to look at the impact of television violence. The complicated relationship between TV and behavior is still being debated. But it was Bandura who opened the floodgates and launched an entirely new area of research.
All right. So interesting study, right? And it's interesting to think that it was so unexpected, right? The finding. I mean, now I think none of you were probably surprised by the finding, right? So, right, as the children observed an adult acting aggressively towards the doll, they learned that that's what you should do with the doll, and they went in and they did the same thing, right? But back then, it was such an unexpected finding, and another kind of right in this other experiment that they were talking about in the video where Bandura showed a movie of an adult acting aggressively towards the doll. Children still learned, right, from the movie as much as from watching somebody in real life, which again kind of sounds maybe obvious to us, right? But back then, as TV was just coming out, it was something that people didn't necessarily expect, right? And then, so in this other study, right, where the adults in the movie were kind of rewarded for aggressive behavior, and then there were other adults who were punished for aggressive behavior, and then others who received no consequences. So, children who saw the adult getting reinforced for an aggressive behavior acted more aggressively towards the Boba doll, and kids who saw the adult being punished for the behavior did not right act as aggressively to the Boba doll. So this is the really kind of the key principle of observational learning, right? And another important point here is that when they were offered reward for imitating the aggressive behavior, they all were able to repeat the aggressive behavior, showing that they have learned it, right? It's not that they haven't kind of noticed it or learned it or whatnot, right? Kids do observe everything in their environment, right? But whether or not they choose to um, reenact this behavior depends on what kind of consequences they've observed for this behavior in their environment, right? So this is really kind of, we're not just kind of blind victims of our environment, as behaviorists have suggested, but um, we actively can choose our behavior based on what we've learned, what kind of knowledge about other people's behavior we've tucked away in our memory from observing others. Since Bandura's study, as the video mentioned, there has been very much research directed at whether exposure to violence in media leads to increased aggression, and there were hundreds and hundreds of studies addressing this question. And as of date, right, research on this violent television films and also video games and music um, showed that indisputable evidence that media violence increases the likelihood of aggressive and violent behavior in both immediate and long-term contexts, right? So, kind of to summarize all these hundreds and hundreds of studies, we know that exposure to violent video games and kind of other forms of media is a causal risk factor for increased aggressive behavior increased aggressive thoughts, right, and aggressive kind of emotions, more feeling more aggressive, and also decreased empathy and prosocial behavior, right? So and this is really concerning because other research has shown that violence in primetime TV has increased by 75% between 1998 and 2006. That's, I mean, there's a lot of violence on TV, and actually, much of violence is in children's shows. I mean, think about all of the cartoons, how much violence there is, right? Um, it's estimated that an average child has viewed 8,000 murders and 10,000 acts of violence on TV by the end of elementary school. And that's a lot of violence that our children watch, right? And from observational learning, we know that they tuck all of this away, right? So, media violence is really considered by a lot of researchers a significant public health threat. In fact, there's only one bigger threat to public health than violent media, and that's smoking and lung cancer. Um, so, some people really choose to not show any kind of media, TV to their children, to kind of protect them from some of those negative effects. But that's, of course, personal choice of everybody. Um, but you know take it or leave it, this is something that we've known for a while, and as media becomes more and more accessible with smartphones and tablets and kind of TV in every room of the house, right? This is something to really kind of take into consideration. um, all right, so last things that I'm going to talk about, in terms of aggression. Again, you can't really talk about aggression and not talk about um, violence that happens in the homes. So, in terms of kind of marital violence between husbands and wives, or unmarried partners, some form of violence happens in 25% of marriages, with 15% characterized by continuing severe violence. So, really, domestic violence is an epidemic. It happens much more often than you might think it's happening. Um, More than half of murdered women are killed by their partner. So, it's kind of a cliche, on TV shows and stuff. When a woman is murdered, they immediately suspect the boyfriend or the husband, but for a reason, right? That's why, because we know that so many women are being killed by the partner. Um, we know that 1 in 3 women throughout the globe experience some form of violent victimization during their lives. 1 in 3 women throughout the globe, and that's a lot of violence that women see. That's a whole different kind of. We could talk for hours about safety of women in the society, and I'm sure you've all kind of had those conversations in other classes, or seen kind of those conversations out in the media. Of course, men are victims of abuse as well. In but it happens much more rarely. So, in 8% of all cases, men are victims of abuse. So, it really is women who are primarily targets of violence, and are victims of severe violence, and even as far as murder. Um, Marital aggression typically occurs in 3 stages. So, there's this kind of cycle of violence, as you see here on the picture on the slide. Um, so, many people kind of have a hard time understanding why a woman who's being abused in her marriage doesn't just leave the partner, right? Shouldn't she just know, right? Shouldn't she just kind of, why is she tolerating it? And she's tolerating it because of this cycle of violence. Because abuse doesn't just continuously happen, it happens in a cycle. So, there's some sort of, right, tension usually starts kind of building. Right, everything is fine, and then there's this underlying tension. Maybe a husband, usually, an abuser is the kind of person who has a hard time kind of controlling their frustrations, controlling their temper, kind of regulating their emotions, finding more healthy outlets for their stressors. Right, their outlet is kind of their wife. And so, as this tension builds, the wife usually kind of feels this tension building. The husband may become less loving, may kind of start making comments or kind of looking at her in a particular way that a victimized woman will learn to kind of notice those subtle little changes in her husband. And so it's kind of the state of anxiety that she lives in. And so oftentimes she actually might just go ahead and kind of do something to sort of trigger violence from him because it's easier to just kind of get it over with than to live in this state of constant tension. And then, finally, when, either the wife kind of did something to finally kind of break the floodgates, or just the time came and the husband has kind of reached his kind of threshold. And this is when the battering incident happens, when he attacks his wife and really kind of physically hurts her. And then after that, usually he becomes extremely remorseful. So he will, usually bring her flowers, gifts. He will, kiss her. He will, apologize. He will, crawl on his knees and beg for forgiveness. And he will tell her that it will never happen again. And, it, and a woman hopes, right? She has this hope that maybe it really is not going to happen again. And for some women, it feels good, this kind of this loving contrition stage, because that's when the husband is all in kind of in her power. Usually in this level, in this kind of part of the cycle, he will do anything that she tells him to do. He's so remorseful, he's so regretful. He's the best, most loving, most excellent husband that you could ever wish for. And oftentimes, this is the part that people see. They will see this kind of loving husband, and they will think that the marriage is really perfect. Um, and the wife will take care to hide the kind of signs of abuse for various different reasons. She may be afraid that um, her husband will become angry if she tells anybody and kill her or beat her even worse. Um, or she may be really kind of embarrassed and really ashamed about, because of course she knows that that's not right, right? Of course she knows, but it's oftentimes is not as simple as just walking out the door. Oftentimes this woman is dependent on her husband for resources. Oftentimes they have children. Um, Usually, an abused husband will make sure, or abusive husband will make sure that a woman is pretty alienated. He will, oftentimes take her to another city. He will not kind of let her have a lot of friends. He will make sure that she doesn't have a lot of contact with her family. So oftentimes she really has nowhere to go. Um, so it's a really complicated question of how a woman gets stuck in the cycle of violence and why she kind of won't leave. Um, um, but these are kind of some you know kind of general reasons behind her staying. And in terms of also, there's this cycle of violence hypothesis. So it says that being abused or neglected as a child increases your likelihood of either becoming an abuser or becoming a victim of abuse as an adult. And so that's another reason why a woman oftentimes may stay in an abusive relationship, because she may have been abused as a child, and this is kind of her norm. This is what she knows, right? Remember, we talked about Bowlby's proposition that our early relationships become a blueprint for all of our future relationships. So, if that's all you've known, that there's relationships, consist of violence, then why would you leave? I mean, you don't think that you can find anything better. I mean, all relationships are like that in your mind. So might as well stay in this one, right? Kind of, there's not as much stimulus or reason to leave as for somebody who knows that this is really not the norm. Um, And then, oh, by the way, if you guys want to get kind of a better look inside the mentality of both the abuser and the victim of abuse and kind of how that cycle happens, an excellent mini series on HBO right now is out. You may have heard about it, see an advertisement for it. It's called Big Little Lies. There's a book about it too by Leanne Moriarty, um, Big Little Lies. It's a really great, realistic kind of portrayal of really what happens in an abusive relationship and how the two, kind of think through it through every stage. It really outlines, that kind of shows you that cycle of violence. Really do check it out. It's a really good show on its own, but it also is a good source of kind of an example of this cycle of violence. Um, and then lastly, as we talk about domestic violence, we have to talk, unfortunately, about child abuse, which happens much more frequently than you would imagine. 3 million children are abused or neglected each year in the United States alone. I mean, all over the world, they're being abused and neglected. In some countries, maybe probably even higher than in the United States. Every day, at least 5 children are killed by their caretaker. I mean, that's just a staggering statistic. I mean, I have a hard time believing this statistic, but it's out there. Um, and research really doesn't kind of um, child abuse happens in any family, right? There's no specific kind of, oh, this type of culture or ethnicity or gender or maybe married versus non-married partners or different levels of social class. None of that matters. Child abuse happens in all those families. We do know that child abuse is more common in families living in a stressful environment. Single parent homes, homes affected by poverty, homes affected by high marital conflict are all kind of risk factors. Stepfathers, we know, have a little bit higher percentage of chances of abusing their stepchildren than actual physical kind of biological fathers. So that's another risk factor. But of course, that doesn't mean that those kind of, it's not a causal relationship, right? So it's a correlation. And of course, being abused severely impacts the development of children, right? It impacts every aspect of their lives, right? They experience developmental delays. They have mental health issues of all sorts, anxiety, depression, right? They may become aggressive themselves. They show physical complaints, right? So you may see them in your office with some sort of weird symptoms, right? Like frequent stomach aches or headaches, right? Of course, that's in itself, again, is not indicative of abuse, but that's maybe one of the red flags that you might consider. And then they show poor school performance. Of course, it's hard to succeed academically when you're being abused at home. And most parents later do express bewilderment and regret about their abusive behavior. So, most parents don't want to abuse their children, right? But in this statistic, a lot of parents, have kind of low uh, threshold for frustration, right? And they get stressed out, and their kids are hard, right? Kids are hard to take care of. It's stressful, and so they may kind of act out and beat up their kids or something, or yell at them, abuse them in some way, and then later regret it. And then kind of similar to the cycle of violence between married partners. Um, and abuse often happens also so from this stress, right? From wherever that stress is coming from, like we said, poverty, single parenthood, marital conflict, discipline and abuse, right? So sometimes parents may think that they're right trying to just discipline their child, like maybe they start spanking them for something that the child legitimately did and does need to get consequences for it, but um, they're so angry that they end up kind of beating their child up more than they intended to, right? This is kind of one of the classic examples of child abuse. They may not know, right, other ways of disciplining their child. They may themselves have low kind of skills of problem solving without turning to aggression. They may have a hard time kind of talking to their children, talking it through without kind of engaging in physical violence. Um, and also parental isolation, lack of support from community oftentimes leads to child abuse because the expression "it takes a village to raise a child." I mean, for a good reason, because like I said, I mean, children are difficult. It's difficult to day to day to take care of children, especially if they're not kind of an easy child, remember we talked about different temperaments of children, right? If the child is more difficult, or has special needs of some sort, it's incredibly stressful, and parents really need support. So, if you do end up working with parents in your practice, this is something to assess kind of whether or not they have enough support. And there are lots of support groups and resources that you could refer them to, but this may be a difference between, you kind of protecting a child from potential abuse. Um, and then sometimes, parents have unrealistic expectations about a child's developmental ability to be quiet or compliant at a particular age, right? They expect the child to sit down and to be quiet and to listen, right? And the child is like 2 years old. Of course they can't do it, right? And the parent gets frustrated and they're like, why don't you ever listen, right? And the child feels bad and they feel like they're messing up all the time, but like developmentally, they don't have the capacity to sit down and be quiet, right? They need to run around, they need to ask questions and, make noise and stuff like that. That's normal, right? And so again, parents really, it's important for them to be educated about development of children in order to have these realistic expectations. um, okay, so that's that. Oops. um, so now I know I promised you guys extra credit. For an extra credit, what I want you guys to do is open up a Word document. And in that Word document, I want you to write about 3 things. Okay? So I want you to do some research on the internet and um, write up from a healthcare provider perspective, right? Something that is obviously relevant to you. I want you to look up and write down signs of marital abuse. So, from somebody on the outside, as a doctor, for example, how could you tell that a woman is being abused in a marriage, right? Because she's likely not going to tell you about it herself. So, how can you kind of spot some of the signs, and what to do if you suspect a domestic violence is happening with this woman? So that's one, right? How to spot domestic violence and what to do about it. Number two, I want you to write about how to spot evidence of child abuse, right? What are some of the signs that you might see in your practice, right? If you were kind of in the um, area, like working with children, right? So signs of child abuse, and again, what to do about it if you suspect child abuse. And then third thing, I want you to write about elderly abuse. So we haven't talked about it here in the lecture, but I want you to kind of research some of the statistics on elderly abuse, kind of who it happens to most likely, what kind of populations might get into these situations more likely, kind of who tends to be the abuser of elderly most often, and again, kind of how to recognize the signs and what to do about it. Okay, so marital abuse, child abuse, and elderly abuse. What are the signs and kind of how to recognize it and what to do if you suspect it? And then for elderly abuse, also add on statistics and kind of some information about how and why it happens to elderly. Um, so write it all up in a Word document and upload it on Blackboard. I will create a separate kind of discussion topic about it where you can upload your responses. I mean, you can just write a response, I guess, on Blackboard too, whatever, however you want to do it. This will be worth 10 extra credit points. So that's 20% of your exam grade. So that can really, really help if you don't feel good about your second exam grade or if you're worried about your third exam. So for 10 extra credit points, do all of those things and submit it to me by let's say by next week. So I'll give you a week. So by next Tuesday, by the end of the day, on Tuesday, I believe that's April 4th. Let me look it up real quick. Yes, April 4th by midnight. Submit your responses to me for 10 extra credit points. And feel free to email me if you have a question about it or want more details or kind of are not sure exactly what the assignment is. I'll be happy to talk about it to you via email. All right, so that's the end of our lecture, and your exam is on Thursday at our usual class time online, and I'll send another reminder email about it. And I will see you all next week. All right, have a good one.